Don, you can go ahead.
Okay, good evening. My name is Don Pavlovich, president of Pathways Serious Mental Illness Society. On behalf of Pathways, I welcome you all for tonight's public lecture, Understanding the Stigmatization of Borderline Personality Disorder. One question I get asked is what are Pathways public lectures and why are they so important? Our long-running public lecture series are a space for the public to learn more about specific aspects of mental illness and the treatments available, as well as issues that concern those with mental illness. They are typically delivered by experts in the field and service providers. Each lecture is followed by a question and answer session that is open to the audience. But please enter your questions into the chat room whenever you're ready to ask a question or when you want a question answered. Pathways Public Lecture Series is one of the many free programs for membership and the public at large. If you're interested in our upcoming lectures or our free offered programs, then please visit Pathways website, info@pathways.smi.org, or phone Pathways office at 604-926-0856. So just to let everybody know, just before I introduce Suzanne, everyone will be muted until the end of the lecture, and then we'll be able to. You might have an opportunity to say something. I'm not very tech savvy, so I'm just hopefully everybody's understanding what I'm trying to get across. And now tonight's lecture topic, understanding the stigmatization borderline personality disorder. What is borderline personality disorder? How might it manifest? How does it affect the individual? And why is it so stigmatized? Here tonight to answer these questions and more is Suzanne Cunningham. Suzanne has her own lived experience with and recovery from a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. So please welcome Suzanne.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me here. Thank you all for attending tonight to hear my talk. So what I want to do at the beginning is actually do a quick reflection activity. I'm going to get Amy to post a link in the chat, and it's going to take you to a web page, and it's going to ask you what are 3 words that you associate with or you think of when you hear the term borderline personality disorder. It's completely anonymous, so just put in kind of the first things that come to your mind, and then enter that in. And then after we show a short video, I'm going to pull that up and we're just going to kind of review it quickly together just to see where everybody is currently at with their understanding or thoughts about the disorder. So yeah, if you just want to hit that link, it will take you there and you can do that. As a way of kind of introducing myself, I have a video that I like to share. I'm going to get Amy to share it. I just want to say first, before we do that, there is a content warning with regards to just suicide. I talk about suicide. I use the F word once. So if that's something that maybe you're just not in a space tonight to hear that story, or you just take offense with profanity, you can mute while that video is playing. The images, you wouldn't have any idea based on the images that I was talking about suicide. So it's not like you can't watch the video. And I think that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to give that little content warning before we go into the video. Actually, I thought of one more thing I wanted to say. My pronouns are she, her. And whenever you're ready to share that, Amy.
Hope is a funny thing, and like misery is everywhere around us. The more we look for it, the more we find it. In February of 2016, I was at the lowest point I'd ever been in my entire life. My life was filled with darkness and pain. It strangled my mind, no longer allowing me to see the options or choices I had to support my mental health. The pain was so extreme and exhaustive that I felt my only option was to end my life. I don't remember being rushed to the ER, but I do remember waking up pissed off that I was still alive and still in extreme amounts of pain. In June 2016, the Parliament of Canada passed federal legislation that allowed adults to request medical-assisted dying. After a brief yet unhelpful stay at the hospital, I had come to the conclusion that based on my long history of mental illness and the extreme emotional pain that caused, I could be granted this way out of living. I had to ask myself, if I only have a few months left to live, how would I spend it? What or who was I going to miss? What did I want to do one last time? Or what did I want to experience that I haven't done yet? So I made a point to do something that brought me joy every day, whether it was laughs with friends, the smell of a secondhand bookstore, the softness of my cat's belly, reading in the sunlight, or just eating my mom's cooking. Slowly, the moments of joy and happiness began to roll into one another, and I began to realize that by having placed my hope in death, I had somehow stumbled upon hope in living. And then my hope grew. It became the possibility that my life could be different, that I could find moments of lightness and sweetness in between the moments of sadness and pain. I was asked today if I thought it was going to get easier. Today I said no. But I know my answer will be different either tomorrow or next week. This is just how mental illness works. It confuses the mind until your hope is lost. I know my hope sometimes hides behind the clouds of my depression and anxiety, but I know it's always there, waiting for me like sunshine on a cloudy day or spring flowers after months of fallen snow. I also know not everyone is lucky to have the confidence that their hope is out there waiting for them. To you, I ask that you have faith in my faith that your hope will return one day. And if nothing else, please know that you're not alone, and that the world would be a lot less wonderful without you in it.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Apparently, you guys all got the PG version. I gave the wrong link to Amy. So the universe was just telling us tonight, we just got to keep it PG. All right. So I am just going to share my screen. So this, you should all be able to see this now, this word cloud that everybody kind of contributed to. And yeah, awesome. Misunderstood, lonely, confused. I always just like looking at this because it's like so cool. Cunning. I don't think I've seen that one before. Sensitive, complicated, black and white. Yeah, dual behavior. Cool. So thank you. And I hope afterwards you can kind of remember the words that you put in and just see where you sit now, if there's been anything that has changed for you or shifted in any sort of way over the presentation. Hopefully it does in some way, because otherwise I haven't done my job. All right, so I'm just gonna share the presentation. All right. So my prepared talk. So in 2016, I was diagnosed with BPD after struggling with mental health challenges since childhood. As a result, I was able to get the appropriate treatment and recover from the diagnosis. I have to admit that when I first heard about borderline personality disorder in university, after having been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I silently wondered and was terrified that I did have BPD. Terrified because of the way the disorder was described in the textbook and the stigma attached to it. When I got this diagnosis, and more importantly, when I started working with individuals with BPD as a peer support worker, I saw the implications this diagnosis has. I was driven to learn more about it so I could better advocate for my clients and myself. BPD is especially complicated, so I'll only be touching on some broad concepts. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A at the end if you'd like more information, and I will try my best to answer, but no guarantees. Some people may know about BPD through TV and movies, Fatal Attraction, Single White Female, not really the type of person you would want over for dinner or in your life. These portrayals cherry pick and exaggerate symptoms for the story without thought for or compassion for the individuals with the disorder. We know that it's important how and when the media portrays individuals, especially to those that have no experience with individuals with this disorder. However, it can be just as damaging to the individuals that have a disorder. It teaches us that we are dangerous, unlovable, and I can say from personal experience, this internal stigma is some of the hardest to get over. I'd also just like to mention that this is my understanding based on personal research and my own experience and has not been academically peer reviewed. When we look into the research, there seems to be agreement on 3 different themes. People with BPD are manipulative, attention-seeking, and are untreatable. Up to 89% of clinicians thought people with BPD were manipulative. The smaller words around the direct quotes are from clinicians in the studies describing individuals with BPD. We know that stigma translates into prejudice and discrimination. So it's concerning that the professionals that are supposed to support and help us have negative attitudes and beliefs about us. It can affect our care. This has real implications for the treatment of people with BPD, as clinicians in the studies showed less empathy and optimism for those with BPD. Some research proposes that this can actually make symptoms worse, prolong treatment, or even go so far as to re-traumatize individuals. This discrimination is real. Today, some clinicians refuse to treat individuals with BPD, and it is still an exclusionary criteria for some mental health or housing programs. So let's explore what BPD is and how it develops to understand why these labels are harmful and incorrect. Oh, someone gave us a nice red line. Love it. I didn't do that, but I love it. Sorry, I got a little distracted there. So personality disorders overall are defined as someone who has difficulty in dealing with relationships and social situations, handling emotions and thoughts, understanding how or why the behavior is causing problems, and finds it hard to change to suit different situations. Estimates show that around 11% of the population has one of the 10 personality disorders. So knowing that, what specifically is BPD? Broadly speaking, BPD is difficulties with emotional regulation, impulse control, interpersonal relationships, and self-image. The way I like to describe it to people is that it is learned maladaptive thoughts and behaviors and a lack of skills to cope in the world. So what are the ingredients? I want to first take a moment to touch on traits versus disorder. We probably have some of any of the criteria of any of the personality disorders. But it's important to remember it only becomes a disorder when it interferes with your daily functioning and quality of life. After all, who isn't afraid of abandonment? I think that's a pretty common concern everyone has. But it only when it starts to interfere with your daily functioning and quality of life. And so according to the DSM-5, you need 5 of the 9 criteria in order to get the diagnosis. So these include fear of abandonment. People with BPD are often terrified of being alone or left alone, or being abandoned or left alone. Even something as simple as a partner being late from work or spending,
So sorry about that, Suzanne. Go ahead and share again.
Okay, I was like, did my screen go away?
I tried to get rid of that red line, but it looks like
Oh.
only the person who did it can remove it.
Oh, no worries. I loved it. It was like an ode to imperfection. And I am working very hard on my perfectionistic tendencies right now. So I was just like, I was all about it. Whoever did it, I love it. Sorry. So let's go back to where we were. Fear of abandonment. Yep. So even something as simple as a partner being late from work or spending time with other people can flare up this symptom. We may beg, cling, start fights, track loved ones' movements, or even physically block the person from leaving. Unfortunately, this behavior tends to have the opposite effect, driving others away. Unstable relationships. People with BPD tend to have relationships that are intense and short-lived. We can fall in love quickly and intensely, maybe believing that the new person can give us some sort of sense of worth or self. Unfortunately, that's not how healthy self-worth works, and we become quickly disappointed when this does not happen. I have heard words like emotional whiplash as a result of the swing between idealization, so love, and devalidation, so hate. This is also known as splitting. It's like living in a world with no grays, all or nothing, good or bad, black or white. Unclear or shifting self-image. When you have BPD, your sense of self is typically unstable. Sometimes we feel good about ourselves, but other times we hate ourselves. We often don't know what we want out of life and frequently change aspects of our life. Think of it as being a social chameleon, changing to fit the environment and people around us. Impulsive self-destructive behaviors. We may engage in harmful behaviors, especially when we're upset. We may impulsively spend money we don't have, binge eat, drive recklessly, shoplift, engage in risky sex, or overdo it with drugs or alcohol. These risky behaviors may help to feel better in the moment, but they often hurt us in the long run. Self-harm. Suicidal behavior and deliberate self-harm is common in people with BPD. Suicidal behavior includes thinking about suicide, making suicidal gestures or threats, or actually carrying out a suicide attempt. Self-harm encompasses all other attempts to hurt yourself without suicidal intent. Common forms of self-harm include cutting and burning, food restriction, but also substance use can be seen as a form of self-harm. Extreme emotional swings. Unstable emotions and moods are common with BPD. One moment you may feel happy and the next despondent. Little things that other people can brush off can send you into an emotional tailspin. These mood swings are intense, but they often pass more quickly than the emotional swings of depression or bipolar disorder, usually lasting a few minutes or hours. Chronic feelings of emptiness. People with BPD often talk about feeling empty as if there's a hole or void inside them. As an extreme, we may feel as if we're nothing or nobody. This feeling is uncomfortable, so we may try to fill the void with things like food, sex, drugs, but nothing really seems to satisfy. Explosive anger. We may struggle with intense anger and have a short temper. We may also have trouble controlling ourselves once the fuse is lit, yelling, throwing things, or becoming completely consumed by rage. It's important to note that this anger isn't always directed outwards. We may spend a lot of time feeling angry at ourselves, and this may be where the self-harm and self-defeating behaviors come into play. Feeling suspicious or out of touch with reality. feeling suspicious and out of touch with reality. We can struggle with paranoia or suspicious thoughts about others' motives. When under stress, we may even lose touch with reality, an experience known as dissociation. We may feel foggy, spaced out, or as if we're outside our own body. Or in the case of derealization, that our environment is alien or surreal. Since a person needs 5 of the 9 criteria to get a diagnosis, this means that there's 256 combinations in order to get a diagnosis of BPD. So it's unfair to paint us all with the same brush, as 2 individuals with the same diagnosis could only have one of the overlapping criteria. Now you're not going to advance. There we go. So now that we have a definition, let's talk about some of the numbers and why it's crucial that we understand and challenge the stigma around it. All right. The common number shown around the internet is that BPD affects 1.6% of the population. Some research notes that it has a lifetime prevalence of 5.9% of the population. I personally wonder about the 1.6, given what we know about stigma and people not seeking mental health services, and due to the fact that 40% of individuals with BPD are originally misdiagnosed. It is traditionally thought that the prevalence is higher in women, with women making up about 75% of those with the disorder. However, we should consider that women are more likely to seek treatment, and that in our culture, women are seen as emotional creatures, often considered hysterical. Since BPD is about emotional regulation, this could account for the tendency upon professionals to diagnose more women with BPD. Conversely, research has shown that men tend to get a diagnosis of PTSD, antisocial personality disorder, or major depressive disorder. So the research is actually beginning to reflect that it isn't gender specific. Of the 1.6%, 10% will die by suicide. This is 50 times the rate of the general population, and 70% will attempt suicide or self-harm. It is reported that up to 80% of those with BPD have a history of trauma. Stats are great, but what does that mean in forms of concrete numbers? So let's look at a case study of Canada. As of 2019, Canada has just over 37.5 million. If we use the 1.6%, that means that there's a little over 600,000 Canadians with BPD, which in turn means that we will lose a little over 60,000 Canadians to this disease. Finally, individuals with BPD make up about 20% of the inpatient world and 10% of the outpatient work by mental health professionals. So overall, about 15% of those accessing mental health services. Knowing that there are over 200 classifications of mental illness, people with BPD definitely represent a good portion of those seeking services. This is why it is critical to start to challenge the stigma around BPD. We are common, it can be a life or death disorder, and our care providers have negative beliefs that affect our treatment and recovery. So through education, we can reduce the stigma. Marcia Linehan, the person who came up with the first biosocial theory, shares that BPD is primarily a disorder of emotion dysregulation and emerges from transactions between individuals with biological vulnerabilities and specific environmental influences. Or in other words, BPD is biologically determined personality traits reacting to emotional stimuli. So let's take a look at biology first. We all have inborn traits. Think introvert versus extrovert. We're somewhere on the spectrum. Inborn traits organizes a person's approach to the world and determines how we learn about the world. People with BPD are often thought to be born with high negative affectivity. Think along the lines of fear and anger. And we also have low levels of effortful control, so we're more impulsive. Approximately 15 to 20% of individuals are born highly sensitive, physically and or emotionally. Just like some people are sensitive to smells or noises, some people have sensitivity to emotions. And this has been found not unique to humans. BPD is about 5 to 10 times more common among people who have first-degree relatives with the disorder. Whether this is 100% due to nature is fuzzy because there's the confounding factor of the chaos of being around individuals with mental health challenges. That said, we do know from twin studies that 40 to 60% of BPD is predicted by genetic factors. It's important to note that it is not an inherited trait like eye color, but can develop given the right conditions, putting those with certain genetic vulnerabilities at a higher risk for developing the disorder. A genetic marker, chromosome 9. So I'm not going to pretend to understand the science behind this one, but it is something I would like to do more research. However, Driscoll et al. Did a study about genome-wide linkage to identify the region that influences the manifestation of BPD features. Evidence for linkage was found on chromosomes 1, 4, 9, and 18, with the highest link in chromosome 9. So we're now lucky to have some studies which have done brain scans on individuals with BPD. From them, we can see that individuals with BPD have different brain structures and functions than individuals without BPD, specifically in two main areas, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is made up of the amygdala, people with BPD have amygdalas that are noticeably smaller and may have even gone atrophy. The smaller the amygdala, the more overactive it is. This means that people with BPD when they have an emotion, they have it more intensely, and the return to baseline or cooling off period takes longer. The hippocampus is associated with memory, spatial orientation, and emotional reactions. It's like the body's data processor. The hippocampus decides the correct emotional response, so approach or avoid. For people with BPD, the hippocampus is in a state of hyperarousal. It consistently misinterprets threats and relays faulty messages back to the amygdala. This means that people with BPD are more likely to encounter other people and the world around them as threatening, when this may not be the intent or the realities. Studies have shown that people with BPD have a hard time interpreting neutral faces, often seeing them as expressing negative emotion. This is one I still struggle with today. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, it's a complex name for 3 interconnected glands. It is primarily responsible for the body's production of cortisol. Cortisol is a natural chemical released during times of stress. Extreme stress, especially experienced in childhood and over long, prolonged periods, will lead to abnormal levels of production of cortisol, which is seen in individuals with BPD. The high levels of cortisol affect stem cells, which can inhibit connections between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, and can hardwire pathways between the amygdala and hippocampus to predispose someone to be constantly in the fight or flight response. So in short, BPD has been associated with excessive activities in parts of the brain that control the experience and expression of emotion, specifically the limbic system, which deals with fear and anger. And this may be why emotional instability is a symptom of BPD. The prefrontal cortex affects our rationality and decision-making, and it also inhibits our primal nature. People with BPD have prefrontal cortexes that are inactive and inefficient. This may be one of the reasons for the impulsivity symptoms of BPD. The serotonin transporter, 5-HTT. This is another one I don't really understand. I'm definitely not a biologist or really a scientist. Social sciences, I can be that. However, the serotonin transporter is responsible for transporting serotonin from the synaptic cleft back to the presynaptic neuron. There is evidence of a reduction in serotonin transporter function in individuals with BPD. Just a note on trauma. I mentioned that up to 80% of us have a history of trauma, and we know that physical and psychological trauma changes the brain. It's hard to say exactly if the difference in the brain's functioning with someone with BPD is a direct cause or a consequence of the trauma itself. Maybe it's a combination of the two. The predisposition is there with the trauma amplifying the differences. If we think of the predisposition on a spectrum, maybe individuals born with brain difference, maybe some individuals are born with brain differences, and maybe some aren't quite there, and the trauma is the event that pushes the brain to change. Research shows that trauma puts individuals at risk for developing any mental illness and can actually affect a person's physical health. Oh, never mind, you didn't see that slide. I have not actually done it yet. It's not there. All right, so risky business. When we put this all together, people with BPD are set up for emotional vulnerability, which comprises of high negative affectivity as baseline, sensitivity to emotional stimuli, intense response to emotional stimuli, and longer to return to baseline. So the example I like to give is regard to, if we think of individuals with BPD as being born as drag racing cars and everyone else being born as a station wagon. And it's just something we don't have a choice or control of. So we know that drag cars have very sensitive steering and gas, which can lead to like quickly accelerating and an easy ability to crash if you've ever seen them. On top of that, the brake is this like parachute, which means you don't slow down quickly. So it's just kind of like all of that mashed together. So in short, we're expecting people with a compromised brain structure to function at the same level as the general population. It's like expecting someone with the wrong tool to be able to accomplish a task as quickly as someone with the right tool. I really like this quote. People with BPD are like people with third-degree burns over 90% of their bodies. Lacking emotional skins, they feel agony at the slightest touch or movement. If it wasn't enough, 96% of patients with BPD have a mood disorder during their lifetime, and lifetime depression is reported at 71 to 83%. When BPD is successfully treated, the other disorders often improve too, but the reverse isn't always true. For example, you may successfully treat symptoms of depression and still struggle with BPD. It's like treating the symptoms of the illness, but never addressing the illness itself. So the social aspect of the theory is the experience of invalidation of your emotional states. Our emotional states are diminished, you're just too sensitive, demeaned, you're being dramatic, or discounted, you're exaggerating. That isn't true. The message is that we shouldn't feel the way we feel, and there is something wrong with us for feeling how we feel. This teaches us to distrust and or disbelieve our emotional experiences. We also experience punishment for the expression of painful emotions. Shut up or I'll give you something to cry about. This only serves to intensify the emotional response, ups the ante, which leads to extreme emotions and actions in order to be heard. This actually reinforces emotional escalation in order to get our needs met. It's the intermittent reinforcement which makes it so difficult to stop the learned coping mechanism. We learn that it doesn't always work, but maybe this time it will. Linehan talks about a few different types of emotional environment. There's the self-explanatory abusive home, the poor fit, so a sensitive child born into a family of rational thinkers, or a tulip in a rose garden. The chaotic home, so parents who had an invalidating childhood themselves, who may have their own mental illness or substance use problems. Homes that are financially unstable or move a lot. There may be family conflicts, separation or loss of a caregiver. And then finally, society. Invalidation doesn't only have to come from the home environment. It can come from the school environment, sports, social media, and systemic oppression. You could have the most supportive caretakers, or caregivers, but if you're invalidated everywhere else, your experience and emotions questions, you may be at risk for developing this disorder. So the perfect storm, the sad part about this is that it becomes sort of a feedback loop where both feed into the other, which only makes the circumstances worse. I'm biologically sensitive. My environment invalidates me, which increases my emotional response and actions in an environment that continues to invalidate me. The outcome can mean that we don't learn to accurately label or trust our emotions, which leads to an inability or lack of skills to regulate them. Dan Siegel uses the phrase, name it to tame it. You may have heard of this. Naming our emotions tends to decrease the intensity of them. If you're unable to name the emotion, you're unable to decrease this intensity. And a person who already experiences emotions so intensely, this can be a deadly combination. If we're unable to label our emotions and have an underactive prefrontal cortex, it becomes hard to problem solve emotional states, to avoid or self-soothe extreme mood swings. If a person learns not to trust their internal experience, this can also affect self-image. Individuals learn to search the environment for cues on how to think, feel, and act. BPD makes people hypervigilant, which means we'll always be on the lookout for signs of rejection and are extremely sensitive to emotional nuances. We're constantly checking the social environment for feedback. This can contribute to the experience of emptiness or a lack of self-image, as we are constantly looking to the outside for cues on how to exist. When no one takes our needs seriously or questions our needs, we learn extreme ways of getting others to take them seriously. It goes with learning to up the ante to get someone to listen. This can lead to self-harm or suicide attempts to express our pain. I think this is why we see a big number of individuals with BPD going to emergency departments. We are trying to get acknowledgement that our pain is real and intense, no different than someone with a broken bone. Unfortunately, what we face at the hospital often does the opposite and invalidates our pain, feeding into the cycle again. It can lead to substance misuse, to escape difficult emotions and self-soothe. If a person can't trust their experience, it can lead to the development of self-invalidation. I should be able to do this. I'm broken. No one will love me. What is wrong with me? Individuals with BPD report feeling shame 50% of the time. Think about that for a second. Imagine spending half of your existence ashamed of your actions, emotions, and thoughts. That one gets me every time. I'm like, oh yeah. Anyways, that all said, however, there is hope. There are treatment options. There are ways to support recovery. So medication. Currently, there are no medications on the market that treat BPD. Medications help with the symptoms of depression, anxiety, or impulsivity, but not the root cause of BPD. When BPD is successfully treated, the other disorders often improve, but the reverse isn't always true. Some therapies have been, so CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, helps individuals with BPD identify distorted beliefs and thoughts. I put a star beside this one because this one comes up a lot with regards to treatment for individuals with BPD. I would just like to say I disagree with this. I think that it works later on, but you're expecting people who are in a fight or flight state to somehow be able to access their prefrontal cortex to challenge like some thoughts. And I just don't think that that's possible at the beginning, which is where dialectical behavioral therapy comes in, but I'll touch down on that in a moment. Another one is schema-focused therapy, which helps to reframe the way people view themselves due to poor self-image. Mentalization-based treatment was designed for BPD. Mentalization is the ability to understand the thoughts and feelings which underlies behavior. It brings together aspects of psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, systemic, and ecological approaches. The goal is to increase mentalization capacity, which can improve affect regulation, reducing suicidality and self-harm, and strengthening interpersonal relationships. The two therapies I can speak directly to are psychodynamic therapy, which focuses on unconscious processes that manifest in a person's present behavior. The goals of psychodynamic therapy is self-awareness and understanding the influence of the past on current behavior. I was able to attend a 4-month-long intensive psychodynamic group therapy. From this, I was able to gain insight about my own behaviors by witnessing others engage in the same behavior, get feedback about behaviors in a safe, supportive environment. It was a venue to try new skills. But as with any therapy, it required hard work with a lot of vulnerability and openness to getting feedback and look at what I contributed to the situation. The problem with this type of program is that they're expensive to run with a large quote unquote cost per person. But the outcome actually ends up saving money for the healthcare system in reduction of future hospitalization and emergency department visits. So dialectical behavioral therapy developed by Marshall Lanahan teaches skills for mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, which can all bridge the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex together. If we think of BPD as lacking skills to navigate the world, then this is learning new skills that the general public typically have learned naturally. There is a good prognosis, and in some cases better than other mental illnesses. 50 to 75% of symptoms reduce as we get older. Some symptoms resolve on their own as the person ages, and I would argue naturally learns more socially acceptable coping skills and ways to get needs met. So in short, we learn the language. Zanari, a researcher that has been focused on longitudinal studies of individuals with BPD, showed that after 16 years, 99% of participants were in remission. Remission was defined as 2 or more years without any significant symptoms, and that 60% had been in recovery for years. She defined recovery as symptomatic remission and a good and full and good social and full-time vocational functioning. So let's circle back to that stigma tornado. So the sad part of these stereotypes is that they become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy when accessing mental health services. Oftentimes, these behaviors come from a place of trying to cope and find connection. However, this can lead to frustration and distancing from others, including mental health professionals, which then creates another invalidating situation, creating more behaviors. All this feeds into each other, creating a cycle that can actually re-traumatize individuals. So when I show up to the emergency department for a suicide attempt, I've just confirmed the clinician's view that I'm attention-seeking and manipulative. The clinician distances and invalidates my pain. And because I'm hypervigilant, I'm able to pick up on this, creating more emotional pain, which heightens my emotions even more. And so into this never-ending cycle we go until I either take my life or find some other way out on my own. So I hope you'll agree with me that these labels are concerning. Now that we have a little more education around BPD, let's revisit them. So manipulation has a connotation of malice or some sort of sinister ploy. The label manipulation makes it seem like we're in some kind of control over our actions and that there's some kind of malicious intent behind them. However, our actions are really just desperate attempts to cope with extremely painful circumstances. We are trying to meet needs, but do not have the skills to get our needs met. We are using old skills we learned when young, facing extremely challenging or abusive circumstances that did in fact get our needs met then. However, now we're adults and out of those extreme environments, and it's like everyone else is speaking another language. We are inexperienced, but also resourceful as we try all different ways to get our needs met. It just happens some of these ways aren't traditional or socially sanctioned methods, but we will get there. Marshall Lanahan states, suicide behavior is a response to unbearable suffering. These behaviors have become learned coping mechanisms for when we feel like there aren't any other ways left to cope with the emotional pain, or it may be a method to express emotional pain in a which is more easily understood by the person and or can distract from the high levels of emotional distress. People with BPD experience emotions much more intensely and for longer periods than the general populations. Our brains are not wired the same, and so we do not have complete control of our actions. We are impulsive. When experiencing extreme pain, oftentimes an impulsive thought becomes an action, one we often wish we could take back. We aren't so much attention seeking as we are seeking connection. We just don't know how to express this clearly. And we've learned growing up in these chaotic environments to get our needs met with extremes. We don't have the understanding or language to articulate our need for connection yet. We don't know how to communicate our agony, and we do it in a way that unfortunately doesn't support social bonds. I like this quote by Dr. April Foreman. Your brain is screaming at you to have its needs met, is screaming to be understood, is screaming to be validated. So you start doing some pretty wacky shit in order to get the environment to respond to your brain. It's not untreatable. Remission and recovery is possible. Myself and people I know are proof of this. In the same way individuals with depression cannot change their mood on a whim, individuals with BPD need time and space to learn new skills to support their recovery. I think it's important to remember that the behaviors are not the person, the behaviors are the disorder. Our actions are part of the symptomology. The hurt that these actions can cause is a consequence of the symptom. I'm not trying to minimize or excuse the hurtful actions that myself or others have engaged in, but it may be helpful to remind ourselves not to take it personally and remember the biology. It was only through self-awareness and accepting responsibilities for past mistakes that I was able to change the maladaptive thoughts and behaviors. I have finally learned the language to communicate my needs. This was a slow process and it required a lot of trial and error. We know that to change behavior takes time, especially ones we've been practicing for a long time. While these symptoms may represent themselves over and over, it can be frustrating. But I believe this frustration comes from feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy to fix the quote unquote problem from the supporter, loved one, or healthcare staff. A patient's self-harming can impact a healthcare professional's thoughts. All our work is wasted, I'm a failure, which then can affect their behavior. The nurse withdraws or avoids, and thus reinforces the patient's negative belief about themselves. I'm a bad person. I deserve to be punished. No one loves me. However, there is hope because clinicians want more skills to support individuals with BPD. And studies have shown that after training, empathy and optimism goes up in clinicians. So after learning about BPD, you may have noticed the term borderline personality disorder doesn't really tell us much about the disorder. It was not introduced into the DSM until 1980, so it's relatively new, exactly as old as I am. However, tracing the term borderline, it was first written about by Adolf Stern, who used it to describe patients that didn't quite fit neatly anywhere else. That said, this name isn't very descriptive, and perhaps is part of the reason why it's so easy to forget that our behaviors are not always things we have the tools to control. So Valerie Poor, president of, what is it called? The Treatment and Research Advancement National Association for Personality Disorders, agrees the name BPD is confusing, imparts no relevant or descriptive information, and reinforces existing stigma. So they campaigned unsuccessfully to have the name and classification of BPD changed in the DSM-5, published in May 2013. However, the term BPD remains unchanged, and it was not moved from personality disorder classification to a trauma and stressor related classification with other disorders like PTSD, acute stress, and adjustment disorders. Currently, internationally diagnosis is based on the International Classifications of Diseases, so the ICD-10, and they use the term emotionally unstable personality disorder, and then they have subtypes of impulsive and borderline. Some other names that have been floating around to change BPD to are emotional regulation disorder, emotional dysregulation disorder, impulse disorder, interpersonal regulation disorder, and the controversial complex PTSD, because as you may have remembered, only about 80% of us have that history of trauma. So research on BPD is strikingly sparse compared to mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Compared to disorders. But as we discussed, people with BPD represent a big portion of those accessing services. Taking a look at the brain and behavior research funding, we can see that BPD is not getting research funding proportional to the prevalence. BPD is associated with tremendous emotional and financial burden to individuals, families, and society. And because of this, we need more information about the disorder, more research, which means more research dollars. So through education of ourselves and others, we can encourage the growth of compassion and understanding of the complexity of BPD. We can be allies and advocates for change. We know that allies are important for change within a system and society. Big societal change happens when allies stand up and back those experiencing the discrimination. We have to challenge these stereotypes when they arrive. We know what is thought of as manipulation and attention-seeking behaviors come from a lack of language and skills to get basic needs for connection met. We know that to change behavior takes time, and that these symptoms may represent themselves over and over, and it can be frustrating, but we know that it is not untreatable, and we have research to show that. It just takes time and many stumbles along the way. Based on Zanari's definition of recovery, I can say that I've recovered from my borderline personality disorder diagnosis. I will definitely be challenged by the traits for the rest of my life, but I no longer meet the definition or the criteria for the diagnosis. We can advocate for change with our language choices. We know that language is important and powerful, and we can change the world by the words we use. We need to adopt recovery-oriented language. This is why I use the term individual with BPD, individual lives with BPD, individual has, not borderline patient or borderline client or the borderlines or the cluster B, or they are BPD or I am BPD. We are so much more than a diagnosis. Just imagine if I only thought of myself as being asthmatic or diabetic. BPD is a biological condition just like any other physical ailment, and no one should be defined by their illness. However, I also want to recognize that some people with BPD do identify and prefer to call themselves borderlines or being BPD. I personally have my thoughts on this based on what I know about BPD and my experience, but it is not my or anyone else's place to police how individuals decide to identify. Another example of this is died by suicide rather than commit suicide. The term commit is from a time when it was a crime. We don't say, oh, they committed a heart attack. This is an important distinction. The disease is what terminates the life, not the person. And it's the same with completed suicide. It puts a positive slant on a tragic outcome. It associates a suicide attempt with failure. Again, we would not say they completed a heart attack. Finally, empathy and validation. My personal initial response when I hear about self-harm or suicidal intent is to validate the pain. How much pain must a person be in to choose to hurt themselves or no longer want to live? I once had a therapist describe suicidal intent as homicidal intent turned inward. This was a sort of shock I needed to re-examine these thoughts, to see them as outside of myself and really understand the extreme pain, self-blame, and loathing I had for myself, much like someone who wants to murder someone else. I needed to change my thinking and develop a self-compassionate mentality. I try to remember that I can't judge a person on the choices they make if I don't know the options they had to choose from. This is an idea we could all use. This is an idea we can all remember when interacting with any other human. So let's Let's just basically spread kindness like glitter. I'd like to end this presentation with an acknowledgement of the immense amount of privilege I've had in my recovery. From having a safe place to live, to having financial support from my parents while on disability, to having access to the many mental health resources that come from living in a big city and having public health care. And so these are my resources. And that's it. Ta-da!
Wow, Suzanne, thank you so much. That was, I'm sure I'm not just speaking for myself when I say that that was an incredible presentation. You covered lots of different areas and they were also very beautiful, your slides.
Oh, thanks. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we've already had someone asking for, inquiring about the recording. So yeah, it was very, very nice and very well done. Thank you. So I will I've got some questions here that we've collated from the chat. So just to start off, I'll start with the topic of, I think we'll go with, supporting a loved one who has a borderline personality disorder. So we've got a question: how do I best support a woman who has cyclical highs and lows throughout some days when she has to care for her 3-year-old? The person's concerned that the lady in question disconnects and doesn't engage with her child.
Yeah, so each individual is very different. I would say validate and support the person as much as possible, as well as support the young child too, right? So there's really, unless the individual is willing to engage in therapy and start working on some of those bigger concerns, like get involved in some sort of DBT or something like that, all another human can do is validate. And I think that that's where the learning the new language kind of comes in. That's how I really like to talk about my recovery journey. It was about learning the language and about, just being a safe place to practice, being a safe person to practice skills with, right? So I had people that I could try things out with, and I would bumble and not do them very well. And then they were able to give me feedback or give me that positive reinforcement that, I could directly ask for what I need, or I could directly be like, hey, I'm noticing that you're acting this way. Like, did I do something specifically wrong to you? Or even just being like honest and being like, hey, I'm feeling really vulnerable right now. I really could use a hug, or I really could use some extra support. It was a profound epiphany for me when I realized that I could just ask my mother for a hug, that I didn't need to like act out in different ways in order to get her attention, to give me that physical attention or even that positive attention. It was like, oh wait, I could just say honestly, hey mom, I'm not doing so hot, could you give me a hug? And she responded to that. But I wasn't really taught that as a child, that was acceptable, or and that might just be evidence of, as a family unit, we all have grown so much over the years as well.
Yeah, so it's really about opening up lines of communication and making sure that they feel that they can communicate openly and honestly, and that you're going to do the same with them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So related to treatments, so if someone has no family to help and is on income assistance, do you know what options there are for treatment? This person suggesting that, are there online programs such as DBT Path with Debbie DeMarco Bennett and Catherine C. Holt? I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
I am not, but I do know that there are numerous resources for DBT. I know that there's like support groups online on Facebook that work on using those skills. I do want to say a caution around like Facebook groups. Sometimes at the beginning, I was involved in them. And as my recovery went on, I realized that they caused me more emotional distress than they supported me, because it's a powder keg of a bunch of people who are working on emotional regulation skills. And at any point, like it's a whole bunch of people who have a hard time interpreting the world in a non-threatening way. So if you have words in front of a screen, I think we have all been in that situation where we get a text from a friend or a loved one and we're like, are they mad at me? What happened? Like, or what's the tone of this? Or we get an email and we're like, oh, is my boss like pissed? Or like, what's going on here? And it's just like that misinterpretation when the person was like, oh, I was being sarcastic. I wasn't being serious or whatever, that ability. So amplify that with people who just automatically always go to that space. And like, that's still one I struggle with. I still struggle with it. I will walk in on coworkers that I know like me, and if they don't like greet me with a smile, I automatically go to, oh, what did I do wrong? They're upset with me. So that's still when I have to like deliberately challenge a lot of times, because my brain just automatically interprets everything as threats, right? Like it's just not so much now, but in the past. And it's still something that I occasionally feel my brain, just those old patterns like kind of click, depending on where I am too at my recovery that day, how much stress is going on in my life, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Going back to support, actually, we've got another question about what kind of family support did you have that helped you the most? I mean, you mentioned communication. Are there any other things? Or
for me, it was my family. I think one of the biggest things that supported and healed my family was that my parents owned my experience, whether or not they agreed about it, and were willing to engage in family therapy with me. There are things that happened in my past that we disagree on the wording. I'll give a prime example. I say my mom kicked me out. My mom says that didn't happen. And so I have come to the conclusion of being like, she asked me to leave, which is what she did. But she was like, well, that wasn't an ultimatum. I wasn't kicking you out. I just asked you to leave. You're the one who decided to go. And I'm just like, so just honoring that my experience of all that is different than what their experience was. And I guess also like apologizing for their portion of the journey, whatever it was. My dad is a very rational thinker. He does not get emotions. He doesn't to this day. And one way that we have had to navigate that is just to know that there's that limitation. I had to recognize that. And my dad had to be like, I just don't get this stuff. I can't support you in this way. And that 100%, just having those honest conversation helped, because it was like, I kept going to this stone expecting like water or blood, and he just had no ability to do that. But still being like, I apologize because this limitation that I have did not support you. And just, I think that because I've been in a lot of groups, and I feel so incredibly lucky that my parents both have agreed to go to therapy with me, and have apologized for their contributions in my childhood, and that we've been able to heal. But I've been in groups and witnessed so many people with family members who continue to deny their experience. continue like that wasn't abusive, or that didn't happen that way, or you're being dramatic, and continue to use that language, which is just continuing to invalidate them even more. It doesn't it doesn't matter what the like little bit is. If the person is experiencing those emotions around it, like we can validate those emotions. And I think that's the key part, is we don't have to validate behaviors, but we can validate the emotions. And we can validate that that is their experience of the situation, which is what my parents have done. And they say, this is your story. You can tell your story, because I had to ask them, what are they comfortable with me sharing? What are they not? And they kind of were like, you can share whatever you want. This is your story. This is your experience.
Yeah.
And kind of went with it.
Yeah. Wow, thank you. That was really insightful as well to hear. Okay, another question related to supporting a loved one with borderline personality disorder. I try to support a friend that is borderline. She often says she wants to run in front of a bus. She feels dead inside. When I've called the crisis line or offered to take her to emergency, she doesn't want the help. Sometimes I feel so frustrated that I can't be around her, not sure how to handle her when she is in that kind of heightened state.
Yeah. So this is my personal take on it.
That's what we want.
A lot of times that I feel like that behavior is like that old pattern, right? I need to continue to up the ante because no one's going to give me the attention that I need. And part of that is I don't actually know what I need. So having those conversations, honestly, be like, I want to help you. When you say things like this, or you engage in these behaviors, in order to keep you safe, I must do this. I must call crisis. How can we come up with a plan so that that is not what's going on, and that's not what I have to do? Like, what is it that you need from me when you're in those situations?
So having this conversation before the crisis is what you're saying. Yeah.
And it might become to the point where like you may have to have this conversation a couple times. But also boundaries are extremely important. I do boundaries. There are people that I'm very cautious about who I let in my life. As someone who has recovered from BPD, I do draw individuals who are currently on their recovery journey. But I'm very cautious about who I let in my life, just because I need those boundaries. And it's very, very easy to be pulled into some of that chaos for me. But I need to support my wellness too. And so I just think also paying attention to yourself and giving everything to other people is not necessary, is going to lead you, the supporter, to a place of unwellness as well. And so you're not going to be able to support this individual. So that's my like little caution around supporters helping people with BPD, because it is intense. I get it. I've been there. I've been on the other side. I've been on the side of the person being super intense and doing all of these behaviors. And I've also been on the side of like helping people who are engaging in some of these behaviors. I will mention, because it just popped into my brain, I had a friend who took me in 2016 to the hospital. She was the one who took me originally, before they quickly just dismissed me and discharged me. And then a week later I was back. But after all of that happened, she sat me down and she's like, never again do that, but I will be here if you are. And then I had to disengage from that friendship, because what she's basically telling me was I could go to her every time I was in crisis, and that she wouldn't necessarily be there when I wasn't. So it was just reinforcing that relationship of this is the person I go to when I'm in chaos, and not really having some of those healthy boundaries around it. And I know that that can be a bit different for when it's a family member versus someone who's a friend.
Wow, you covered a lot there. Thanks, Suzanne. I'm going to go on to a different topic just because I'm conscious of the time. So under identifying borderline personality disorder and treatments. So I think you've already covered some of the behaviors typically associated with borderline personality disorder. So perhaps what has research shown as the most effective treatments for supporting those with borderline personality disorder to live a fulfilling life and be contributing members to society?
Dialectical behavioral therapy has the most research behind it. And actually, a lot of people think that therapy modality was created for individuals with BPD, but it wasn't. It was created for people who are chronically suicidal. It just happened that individuals with BPD are very chronically suicidal. Fun random tip for you.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. Just on the same topic of treatments, we'll go back to, we do have some more again with supporting a loved one, but I just want to make sure we cover some more topics. So where can one get intensive psychodynamic group therapy as you did?
I don't know. The program I just learned a month and a half ago, that the program that I attended is no longer available. And that was in, so I live in Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory. Yeah, it was available for like a very, very long time. It was an intensive day treatment program. I was very fortunate to get into it because as of this last year, they closed it down. There is an evening treatment program, but it's not quite, I don't think it's as intensive just because people are expected to work or volunteer during the day. And when I was doing the day treatment program, I was freaking exhausted every freaking night. I was like in bed, asleep. It was the best sleep, most regular routine I ever had because I was just so exhausted at the end of every day.
Thank you, Suzanne. A question here about BPD. If a family member has not told you they have BPD, but they suspect they do, how do you suggest bringing up the topic? In the past, they've been very defensive with mental health topics.
I don't think you can. I think until like they're ready to start to look at some of that stuff. And we see this all the time in mental health. Like, what does, and the question, even within our healthcare system, at least within the public healthcare system, is do we even put that label on their chart? Because once that label's there, it is there for life and it can infect so many different things. I already said that there are programs that will exclude you. So like, what is the value of getting that label, right? And even when I was talking about like the identity factor, like there's that unclear shifting self of image, which I think it's when we give a label like BPD to individuals who have an unclear shifting sense of self, we just gave them a label. And some of them I feel like just latch onto that because they don't really know who they are. So I don't necessarily know if getting that label assigned to you is always the best step, at least very early on in the process. I would just try and get that person, supported to some sort of mental health professionals in some way, whatever that looks like in the area that person is. And the person just might not be ready to have those conversations yet. And I think we just need to respect that everyone's on their own journey. I don't think I was 100% not ready for my recovery journey to start before it did. 100% was not ready. And I'm sure it caused my parents a lot of pain to see how much pain I was in. And I didn't start my recovery till 5 years ago when I was 35. And I struggled a lot. And my parents in the last 5 years have been like, we have never seen you be as well as you are now, right? But I wasn't ready. I just wasn't ready to be where I was. And I know that that is not what people want to hear. And it is very frustrating watching. I see it with the people I work with. And I'm just like, just listen to me. I can give you a rope. Just follow the rope through the swamp and you won't fall in and it will all be great. But they can't, because it's their journey. And all I can do is plant seeds and create positive experiences in the interactions that we have, and try and instill those moments of hope.
Thank you, Suzanne. So we have a question here. Can BPD start at an earlier age, as in preteens or preschool? Do you know?
That I don't know, but I think that being aware of the possibility. I mean, personally, I think a lot of the DBT skills should be taught in schools. Like the distress tolerance, the self-regulation, even the interpersonal effectiveness, they're all great skills. And I think some people are just very lucky, very fortunate to be born in families or with parents that have learned these skills either from their parents or naturally and are able to pass them on. Like I look at a lot of my friends who are parenting young children and I'm like, mind blown. What? You're validating like your 4-year-old feelings? That would not have flown when I was like a tot. So I think we're seeing some of that shift going over. And I think if you're like kind of worried or concerned about it, you can do research on your own and look up what some of those skills are, and look up like, how can I support a little one to learn how to self-soothe and work through some of this stuff, some of these like big emotions. And if you're very concerned about the individual safety, take them to see somebody. Like that's why there's mental health experts, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Suzanne. So going back to supporting a loved one with BPD, I have quite a long one here. So this person says that they're trying to support a friend who has BPD traits. She's all alone and has asked this person to move in with them and their husband. But this is not a very realistic option for various reasons. Mm-hmm. She's very angry about this and has been in a rage for a while, telling this person how selfish they are. So this person doesn't know how to help her know that she's still there for her, even though she can't fulfill this desire. Mm-hmm. She lives 5 hours away from her friend and has told her that she would visit her regularly, and she's acknowledged and validated her feelings, but she's still very upset, and it's very heartbreaking to see her in so much pain. Do you have any suggestions there?
No, it sucks when people we care about and love are in pain. It just does. Is that makes us human. There's just not a lot that we can do. If you're already validating, you're already showing up and being like, I'm here, like when you're ready to talk or whatever, like that you're planting those seeds, right? I talk a lot about planting seeds. And we just sometimes have to be patient. And yeah, sometimes just giving space as well can also help, just for your own sanity. But yeah, I know it sucks. Try and support like as much as you can. And yeah, I'm sorry. I have no advice. You already did all the things that I would suggest. You already know what you're doing. You don't need me.
Thanks, Suzanne. We have a question here as well about aggressive behavior, so that this person's son is very unstable, and so it's their son, sorry, and he's very aggressive towards them, and they would like to ask what they have to tell him back if he's always swearing, talking back and arguing and trying to get this person's attention by conflict.
Without knowing 100% of the details, I would say like just having a boundary, right? Like it seems like you're having a lot of emotions right now. The way that we're communicating right now is not working for me. So when you're at a space that we can have these conversations, let's engage. But if you continue to engage, like if you're like, no, I'm not going to engage, and then they keep upping the ante, and then you engage, you're just reinforcing that behavior in some ways. But that also said, like there's so many nuances, especially around violence, that I don't feel comfortable like without knowing. I just don't feel comfortable with that one.
No, of course, I understand. Thanks, Suzanne, for sharing what you could there. Yeah, related to that, and I'm not sure, maybe this is something else that you might not be able to answer, but could you maybe, is there anything you could say to speak to with regard to boundary setting with a BPD person when they're already angry and lashing out?
Yeah, I think for me, it a lot of it is just like the like I am here for you, but we can't continue to communicate this way, right? So as well as doing a lot of doing chats when the person is not escalated. So it's like, okay, when you are feeling this way, how can I support you? How would you like me to approach you? What words will help? So I have had to almost train my mother in things to say and what she can and can't say. And she's gotten very good at it. But I didn't realize that I could do that. And I think it's actually not a conversation that we have, and we should have with people when they are feeling okay. Like when you're feeling shitty, how can I support you? Like, would it be helpful for me to bring over like a meal for you? Would it be helpful for me to remind you that you like these breathing exercises? Like just having that conversation when everyone is in a good space. I think we should be doing that all the time with people, because like sometimes my mom knows all of the things to suggest to me if I'm in an elevated state. But if I am too elevated, I'm like, fuck you, mom. I know this shit. If I could do this, I would have done it already, but I'm already too escalated. So just like she needs to like having those conversations is one, when before I get to like that really emotional, like I'm crying on the phone, it's having that conversation. Oh, you mentioned in the past that having like a hot shower helped. Have you tried that? Have you thought about that? That kind of stuff. So we've been able to have those conversations. And I think having the conversations when everyone is level and really coming from it is, I want to help you and you're the expert on you. So you tell me how you would like me to approach this situation. What words do you want me to use? Like, do you want space? Like, how are we going to navigate this? And when you get escalated, there may be times that I need to step away, and I need to do that for myself. And just being clear about that when everyone is in a like not highly intense reactive state.
Yeah, that sounds like really good advice. I think we're going to have just one last question, Suzanne. We are conscious of the time. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how much you'll be able to speak to this, but it's quite a technical question. It's related to treatment. So I believe this person's referencing something that you had in the presentation. It was, at what point does the HPA axis give up? Is there?
Oh, the HPA, the hypopituitary adrenal axis. At what point does it give up? As in, it keeps pumping cortisol through you all of the time? I don't think it ever does. I think it just keeps going. But yeah, definitely. We do know that heightened cortisol does affect the heart. It does affect hypertension. It does have a lot of physical, like it does affect you physically. And we do know from the research that those people who experience trauma as a child, and the more trauma they experience, thus the more cortisol they have through them, we know the long-term research that shows that those individuals die sooner from various like diseases like heart disease or diabetes or all of that different fun stuff. So it just really puts you at a health risk.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions, and thanks to our audience for putting some really interesting and interesting questions to Suzanne. We will be having another well, it's going to be a panel, a Q&A panel, and Suzanne will be there. It will be a panel with people with living experience of different mental illnesses. So there will be another chance to ask Suzanne more questions at a later date. So I will hand over to Don now to close.
Well, thank you all for participating. Susan, what an eye-opener. Really enjoyed your presentation and what you've been through. It was very, very helpful. Again, I really appreciate what you've gone through and where you're headed for. So it seems very positive to me. Just to let everybody know that our next lecture series is September the 29th, and this will be dealing with financial planning for families affected by mental illness. It will be a question and answer series. So it's we'll be starting at 7:30 or 7 o'clock to 8:30. And that's with financial advisors Bill Murdoch and Hannah. So the next one after that will be October the 18th, and this will be a self-care for caregivers. And that would be a very interesting one to attend if you can. Pathways will be having a support group session tomorrow via Zoom. So if anybody would like to participate, please call the office or just go onto our website and you can log in. So again, I really appreciate Susan for everything that you have said, and thanks for being very insightful, and Amy and Valeska, a fine job. So with that being said, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up.
You're welcome.